Hey there, and welcome to After Dark Horrors. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always cool to see how connected we all are. I think you'll enjoy these stories. Honestly, there's something you won't find anywhere else. So, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that background hum, and let's get started. Have you ever wondered what happens when the person driving your ride becomes your worst nightmare? Tonight, I'm sharing 10 absolutely terrifying true stories about Uber drivers that will make you think twice before getting into that next car. These aren't urban legends or creepypasta tales. These are real experiences from real passengers who lived through encounters that still haunt them today. From drivers who took passengers on routes to nowhere, to encounters that ended with police chases and missing persons reports. These stories reveal the dark side of rideshare culture that nobody talks about. Some of these passengers barely escaped with their lives. Others weren't so fortunate. So buckle up and make sure your doors are locked. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at that Uber notification the same way again. Story number 1 takes us to downtown Portland on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Sarah, a 26-year-old marketing coordinator, had just finished a late client meeting and needed to get home to her apartment across town. The rain was coming down hard, and finding a taxi seemed impossible, so she opened her Uber app like thousands of people do every single night. The app showed a driver named Marcus with a 4.8-star rating, driving a dark blue Honda Civic. Everything seemed normal when she received the confirmation, but something felt off the moment Marcus pulled up to the curb. First, the car didn't match the license plate in the app. Sarah noticed this immediately but convinced herself she must have misread the numbers in the rain. The driver rolled down his window and called out her name, which seemed to confirm this was her ride. She climbed into the back seat, shaking off the raindrops and settling in for what should have been a 20-minute trip home. Marcus seemed friendly enough at first, making small talk about the weather and asking about her evening. But as they drove deeper into the city, Sarah realized they weren't heading toward her neighborhood at all. When she mentioned this to Marcus, he simply said he was taking a different route to avoid construction traffic. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Sarah's unease grew when she noticed Marcus watching her intently in the rearview mirror. His eyes would dart back to hers whenever she looked up from her phone, and there was something unsettling about the way he smiled when their eyes met. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 40. They were now driving through industrial areas Sarah had never seen before, past empty warehouses and abandoned lots where streetlights cast eerie shadows on cracked pavement. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows and creating a sense of isolation that made Sarah's skin crawl. When she asked Marcus again about their route, his demeanor changed completely. The friendly conversation stopped, replaced by terse, one-word answers. He turned up the radio, drowning out her attempts to communicate, and began driving faster through the empty streets. Sarah tried to track their location on her phone, but they seemed to be moving through areas where GPS signal was weak. Her phone kept losing connection, showing only blank spaces where street names should have appeared. The battery was draining quickly, and she realized with growing panic that she had forgotten to charge it during her meeting. As they approached what looked like the outskirts of the city, Marcus suddenly pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed gas station. The lot was dark, except for a single flickering light above a dumpster that cast strange shadows across the wet asphalt. Marcus turned off the engine and sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat over the sound of rain pattering against the roof. When she asked why they had stopped, Marcus turned around in his seat and looked at her with an expression she would later describe as predatory. He told her that her phone had been giving him problems all night, that the GPS kept glitching and sending him in circles. He said they needed to wait for the rain to calm down before he could figure out where they were. But Sarah noticed that his own phone was working perfectly fine, mounted on his dashboard and showing clear navigation. The minutes dragged by, with Marcus making increasingly uncomfortable comments about Sarah's appearance and asking personal questions about her living situation. When she tried to end the ride through the app, she discovered her phone had finally died completely. Sarah realized she was trapped in a car with a stranger in an isolated location with no way to call for help. Every instinct told her this situation was about to get much worse. She began looking for ways to escape, noticing that Marcus had engaged the child locks on the rear doors. That's when she remembered the emergency whistle her mother had given her months earlier, attached to her keychain. Sarah had thought it was an overprotective gesture at the time, but now it might be her only lifeline. When Marcus stepped out of the car, claiming he needed to check something under the hood, Sarah saw her chance. She managed to unlock the front passenger door from the inside and slipped out into the rain while Marcus was distracted with the engine. She ran toward the gas station, hoping to find help or at least a phone to call the police. But the building was completely dark and abandoned. Behind her, she could hear Marcus shouting her name, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. Sarah spotted a 24-hour diner about 2 blocks away, its neon sign flickering through the rain like a beacon. She ran through puddles and empty streets, her work shoes slipping on wet pavement, while Marcus's car headlights swept back and forth searching for her. She burst through the diner doors, soaking wet and terrified, startling the night shift waitress and 2 customers. When she explained what had happened, the waitress immediately called the police, while one of the customers let Sarah use his phone to call her roommate. The police arrived within minutes, but Marcus and his car were gone by the time they reached the abandoned gas station. The license plates Sarah had seen didn't match any vehicle registered in the Uber system, and there was no driver named Marcus associated with her ride request. The investigating officer explained that Sarah had likely been the victim of a fake Uber scam, where criminals create fake driver profiles, or simply wait near popular pickup locations and prey on unsuspecting passengers who assume any car that stops is their legitimate ride. Sarah learned that she should always verify the license plate, driver photo, and vehicle description before getting into any rideshare vehicle, no matter how rushed or desperate she might be to get home. The second story comes from Miami, where 23-year-old college student Jake requested an Uber after a night out with friends in South Beach. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he called for his ride, and the app showed a driver named Carlos in a white SUV who would arrive in 4 minutes. Jake was tired and slightly intoxicated, which may have dulled his awareness of warning signs that might have been obvious under normal circumstances. When the white SUV pulled up, he climbed into the back seat without carefully checking the license plate or driver details. Carlos seemed normal at first, asking Jake about his evening and commenting on how busy the nightlife scene was. But as they drove away from the beach area, Jake noticed they were heading in the wrong direction entirely, moving toward residential neighborhoods instead of toward his apartment near the university. When Jake pointed this out, Carlos claimed there was an accident on the main highway and he was taking an alternate route. This seemed plausible given Miami's notorious traffic. So Jake settled back and tried to stay awake during what he expected would be a longer journey home. But after 30 minutes of driving through increasingly isolated suburban streets, Jake realized they were nowhere near his neighborhood or any major highway. The area looked completely unfamiliar, with darkened houses and empty streets that seemed far removed from the urban landscape he knew. Carlos had stopped making conversation and was now driving with a focused intensity that made Jake uncomfortable. The radio was playing Spanish-language talk shows at a low volume, but Carlos kept adjusting the dial as if searching for something specific. Jake tried to use his phone to check their location, but his battery was nearly dead, and the signal was weak in whatever remote area they had entered. The few street signs he could see in the darkness showed names he had never heard of, suggesting they were far outside Miami proper. When Jake asked again about their destination, Carlos told him to relax and that they would be there soon. But the way he said it, combined with his refusal to explain where exactly they were going, sent chills down Jake's spine. They turned into what appeared to be an industrial complex, past warehouses and shipping containers that looked abandoned in the pre-dawn darkness. Carlos drove slowly through the maze of buildings, as if looking for a specific location, or perhaps checking to make sure they weren't being followed. Jake's phone finally died completely, cutting off his last connection to the outside world. He realized he was completely dependent on Carlos for transportation, with no way to call for help or even navigate back to familiar territory on his own. Carlos pulled up beside a large warehouse and turned off the engine. In the sudden silence, Jake could hear the sound of his own breathing and the distant hum of highway traffic that seemed miles away. Carlos turned around and told Jake they needed to wait here for a few minutes. When Jake asked why, Carlos claimed he was waiting to meet someone who would help them get back to the main roads. But something in his tone suggested this wasn't the whole truth, and Jake began to suspect he was being set up for something much worse than an inconvenient detour. Jake noticed that other vehicles were parked around the warehouse complex, some with their lights off but engines running, as if people were conducting business that required quick getaways. The whole scene had the atmosphere of illegal activity, and Jake realized he might be witnessing or being drawn into something dangerous. Carlos stepped out of the SUV and walked toward one of the other vehicles, leaving Jake alone but unable to escape since he had no idea where he was or how to get back to civilization. Through the windshield, Jake could see Carlos talking with other men in hushed tones, occasionally gesturing back toward the SUV. Jake made the decision to try to escape on foot rather than wait to discover what Carlos had planned. He slipped out of the vehicle and began walking quickly toward what he hoped was the exit from the industrial complex. Staying in the shadows between buildings, behind him, he heard Carlos shouting in Spanish, apparently having discovered his passenger was missing. Car engines started, and headlights began sweeping across the complex as multiple vehicles joined the search for Jake. Jake found himself running through a maze of warehouses and storage facilities, trying to stay hidden while looking for a way back to the main road. He could hear vehicles circling the area, their occupants calling out to each other in Spanish as they coordinated their search. Eventually, Jake spotted a security guard at a gated entrance to the complex. The guard was initially suspicious of Jake's story, but when he saw the vehicles searching the area with their lights, he allowed Jake to use his phone to call the police. By the time police arrived, Carlos and the other vehicles had disappeared. The license plate Jake remembered didn't match any registered Uber driver, and there was no record of a driver named Carlos picking him up that night. The police explained that Jake had likely been targeted by criminals who use fake rideshare identities to kidnap people for robbery, human trafficking, or other criminal purposes. The industrial complex was known to be a location where such activities took place. Our third story takes us to Chicago, where 31-year-old nurse Rachel was working a late shift at the hospital and needed to get home to her apartment in Lincoln Park. It was nearly midnight when she requested her Uber, and she was exhausted after a 12-hour shift dealing with emergency patients. The app showed a driver named David with a 5-star rating driving a black sedan. Rachel was pleased to see the high rating and expected a smooth, professional ride home after her stressful day at work. David arrived exactly on time and seemed courteous, helping Rachel with her work bag and asking how her shift had gone. As a healthcare worker, Rachel was accustomed to making conversation with strangers and felt comfortable sharing that she worked at the nearby hospital. The first part of the journey proceeded normally, with David taking the expected route through downtown Chicago toward Lincoln Park. But as they approached Rachel's neighborhood, David began asking increasingly personal questions about her work schedule, living situation, and daily routines. Initially, Rachel assumed David was just making friendly conversation, as many Uber drivers do, but his questions became more specific and invasive, asking about what time she usually left for work, whether she lived alone, and what her apartment building's security was like. Rachel began to feel uncomfortable and tried to redirect the conversation, but David persisted with his questioning. He seemed particularly interested in her schedule, asking multiple times about when she worked night shifts and when the hospital was least busy. As they reached her neighborhood, Rachel noticed that David was driving very slowly and taking a circuitous route through residential streets rather than heading directly to her address. When she mentioned this, he claimed he was avoiding construction, but Rachel could see no evidence of any road work. David began driving past her apartment building repeatedly, circling the block several times while continuing his interrogation about her personal life. Each time they passed her building, he would slow down and study it carefully, as if memorizing details about entrances, windows, and security features. Rachel realized with growing alarm that David was conducting surveillance on her home while keeping her trapped in his vehicle. She asked him to stop and let her out immediately, but David claimed he was still looking for the exact address, despite having GPS navigation clearly showing their location. When Rachel tried to end the ride through the app, David noticed and became agitated. He told her they needed to complete the trip properly and that she couldn't just jump out of his car. His tone had shifted from friendly to controlling, and Rachel realized she was dealing with someone who had ulterior motives. David continued circling her neighborhood for nearly 20 minutes, asking detailed questions about her work colleagues, her roommates, and her daily routine. Rachel gave increasingly vague answers while trying to figure out how to escape the situation safely. Finally, Rachel spotted a police patrol car at a red light and began waving frantically from the back seat of David's car. The officers noticed her distress signals and pulled David over immediately. When police questioned David about why he had been circling the area and holding his passenger, he claimed there had been a misunderstanding about the destination. But when they checked his phone, they discovered he had been taking photographs of Rachel's apartment building and had researched her personal information online. Further, investigation revealed that David had been using his position as an Uber driver to stalk female passengers, particularly healthcare workers with predictable schedules. He had collected detailed information about multiple women's homes and routines, apparently planning future break-ins or assaults. Rachel learned that she should never share personal information with rideshare drivers, no matter how friendly they seem, and should always be suspicious if a driver takes unusual routes or shows excessive interest in her living situation. The fourth story comes from Las Vegas, where 28-year-old software developer Mark was leaving a conference at one of the major casinos and needed to get back to his hotel across town. It was around 10 p.m. when he requested his ride, and the strip was crowded with tourists and convention attendees. The app showed a driver named Tony with a decent rating, driving a grey four-door sedan. Mark was tired from a long day of presentations and was looking forward to getting back to his hotel room to prepare for his flight home the next morning. When Tony arrived, he seemed professional and courteous. Asking Mark about his visit to Las Vegas and whether he had enjoyed the conference. As they drove away from the casino, Tony mentioned that he had been driving for Uber for several years and knew all the best routes to avoid traffic. Initially, the conversation was pleasant and normal. Tony shared stories about interesting passengers he had picked up and gave Mark recommendations for restaurants and attractions he might visit on future trips to Las Vegas. But as they drove deeper into the city, Mark noticed they were heading away from the hotel district and into residential areas he didn't recognize. When he mentioned this to Tony, the driver claimed he was taking a shortcut to avoid construction on the main strip. Tony's demeanor began to change as they drove through increasingly isolated neighborhoods. His friendly chatter stopped, and he began making cryptic comments about Las Vegas being a dangerous city where people could easily disappear without anyone noticing. Mark tried to track their location on his phone, but Tony had installed some kind of signal jamming device in his car that interfered with GPS and cellular connections. Mark's phone showed no service, and he realized he was cut off from any way to call for help. Tony began talking about criminal activities he claimed to have witnessed during his time as a driver, describing in disturbing detail various crimes that had supposedly occurred in the areas they were driving through. His stories became increasingly graphic and violent. Mark noticed that Tony kept checking his rearview mirror obsessively, as if watching for police or being followed. The car smelled strongly of cleaning chemicals, and Mark spotted what appeared to be plastic sheeting in the trunk when Tony opened it to adjust something. They had been driving for over an hour when Tony finally stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned construction site on the outskirts of the city. The area was completely dark except for distant city lights, and there were no other vehicles or people visible anywhere. Tony turned off the engine and sat in silence for several minutes. When Mark asked why they had stopped, Tony told him they needed to wait for someone to arrive. Mark asked who they were waiting for, but Tony refused to provide any details. Mark realized he was in serious danger and began looking for ways to escape. The construction site was surrounded by chain-link fencing, but he spotted a gap near one of the gates that might allow him to get away if he could reach it. When Tony stepped out of the car to make a phone call, Mark seized his opportunity. He jumped out of the passenger side and ran toward the gap in the fence, ignoring Tony's shouts behind him. Mark found himself running through a partially constructed housing development, dodging around heavy machinery and construction materials, while Tony pursued him in the car with headlights blazing. Eventually, Mark reached a main road and flagged down a passing police patrol car. The officers were initially skeptical of his story, but when they investigated the construction site, they found evidence that it had been used for illegal activities. Tony's vehicle was found abandoned nearby. An investigation revealed that he wasn't actually an Uber driver at all. He had been using a fake account to prey on tourists and conference attendees who were unfamiliar with Las Vegas geography. The fifth story takes place in Phoenix, where 25-year-old graduate student Lisa was attending a friend's birthday party and needed a ride back to her apartment near Arizona State University. It was close to 1 a.m. when she called for her Uber, and she had been drinking moderately throughout the evening. The app showed a driver named Miguel with good ratings driving a dark pickup truck. Lisa was somewhat surprised to see a truck rather than a car, but rideshare drivers in Phoenix often used various types of vehicles, so she didn't think much of it. Miguel arrived on time and seemed friendly, helping Lisa into the passenger seat and asking about her evening. As they began driving toward her apartment, Miguel mentioned that he was new to the area and might need help with directions since his GPS wasn't working properly. Lisa was happy to help navigate, giving Miguel turn-by-turn directions toward her neighborhood near the university. But as they drove, she noticed that Miguel wasn't following her directions and seemed to be heading in the wrong direction entirely. When Lisa pointed this out, Miguel claimed he knew a better route and that her directions would take them through dangerous neighborhoods that were unsafe at night. This seemed plausible, as Lisa wasn't entirely familiar with all parts of Phoenix and trusted that a local driver would know best. However, they continued driving for what seemed like an excessive amount of time, passing through areas that looked increasingly rural and isolated. Lisa began to recognize that they were heading out of the city entirely, into desert areas where development was sparse. Miguel's conversation became strange and disjointed, with him making comments about how easy it would be for someone to disappear in the Arizona desert without anyone finding them. He talked about bodies being discovered years later by hikers, if they were ever found at all. Lisa tried to use her phone to check their location, but Miguel told her that cell service was spotty in the areas they were traveling through. When she insisted on trying to call someone, Miguel became agitated and told her to put her phone away. The truck continued into increasingly desolate territory, past cacti and scrub brush that stretched endlessly in all directions. Lisa realized they were now far from any populated area, with no lights visible except for distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. Miguel pulled off the main road onto a dirt track that led into the desert. The truck bounced and lurched over rough terrain while dust clouds kicked up behind them, reducing visibility and creating a sense of complete isolation from civilization. Lisa demanded to know where they were going, but Miguel refused to answer her questions. Instead, he talked more about the desert and how perfect it was for making people disappear permanently. His tone had become threatening and predatory. When the truck finally stopped in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere, Miguel turned off the engine and the headlights, plunging them into complete darkness. Lisa could hear only the sound of wind through desert vegetation and distant coyotes howling. Miguel told Lisa they were going to wait there until sunrise, claiming he needed to meet someone who would help them get back to the city. But Lisa suspected this was a lie and that Miguel had brought her to this isolated location for sinister purposes. Lisa remembered that her phone had an emergency GPS beacon that could work even without regular cellular service. While Miguel was distracted, looking at something outside the truck, she managed to activate the emergency feature and send a distress signal with their location. The signal was received by emergency services, who dispatched search and rescue teams to the GPS coordinates. Lisa tried to keep Miguel distracted and prevent him from driving away from the location until help could arrive. When helicopter searchlights appeared on the horizon, Miguel panicked and attempted to flee on foot into the desert. Lisa was able to signal the rescue helicopter with her phone's flashlight, leading to her quick rescue and Miguel's eventual capture. Investigation revealed that Miguel had been using fake rideshare accounts to abduct women and take them to remote desert locations. Several other victims had gone missing in similar circumstances, but Lisa was the first to successfully summon help. Story number 6 brings us to Seattle, where 42-year-old business consultant Jennifer was working late at her downtown office and needed transportation to SeaTac Airport for an early morning flight. It was nearly midnight when she requested her ride, and the app showed heavy demand with surge pricing in effect. The driver who accepted her request was listed as Robert, with a 4-star rating and driving a dark blue minivan. Jennifer was initially pleased to see a larger vehicle since she had luggage for her business trip, but she would soon discover that the spacious interior served a much more sinister purpose. Robert arrived exactly when the app predicted and helped. Jennifer loaded her suitcase and carry-on bag into the back of the minivan. He seemed professional and courteous, asking about her destination and whether she preferred any particular route to the airport. As they began the journey from downtown Seattle toward the airport, Robert made normal conversation about traffic conditions and Jennifer's business travel schedule. Jennifer appreciated his professionalism and began working on her laptop, reviewing presentations for the next day's meetings. But about 20 minutes into the trip, Jennifer noticed they had left the main highway and were driving through industrial areas that didn't seem to be on any logical route to SeaTac Airport. When she asked Robert about the detour, he explained that there was an accident blocking the main freeway. Jennifer tried to check traffic conditions on her phone, but Robert had installed what appeared to be signal-blocking equipment in his vehicle. Her phone showed no cellular service or data connection, making it impossible to verify his claims about traffic or to track their actual location. Robert's conversation began to take on disturbing undertones as he asked detailed questions about Jennifer's business travel schedule, whether her colleagues knew exactly when she was supposed to arrive, and what would happen if she missed her flight. The minivan continued through increasingly isolated industrial zones, passing warehouses and shipping facilities that appeared to be closed for the night. Jennifer realized they had been driving for over an hour without getting any closer to the airport. When Jennifer demanded that Robert take her directly to SeaTac Airport immediately, his demeanor changed completely. He told her to stay calm and that they would reach their destination soon, but his tone had become threatening rather than reassuring. Jennifer noticed that the back of the minivan had been modified with additional locks and reinforced panels, as if designed to prevent passengers from escaping. There were no interior door handles on the sliding doors, and the windows had been tinted so darkly that no one could see inside. Robert continued driving through the industrial district while making increasingly ominous comments about how easy it would be to dispose of evidence in the various facilities they were passing. He seemed to know the area intimately, pointing out specific buildings and their uses. The minivan finally stopped at what appeared to be a waste processing facility, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Robert told Jennifer they were meeting someone who would help resolve her transportation problem, but she realized she was being handed off to accomplices. Story number 8 takes us to Denver, where 33-year-old nurse practitioner Amanda was finishing a late shift at the hospital and needed to get home to her apartment in the suburbs. It was nearly 2 a.m. when she requested her ride, exhausted after dealing with several emergency cases. The app showed a driver named Carlos with a high rating, driving a white sedan. Amanda was relieved to see a highly rated driver, as she had heard stories from colleagues about problems with late-night rideshare experiences. Carlos arrived promptly and seemed courteous, asking Amanda about her shift and whether she worked at the hospital regularly. As a healthcare worker, Amanda was accustomed to sharing general information about her profession and didn't think twice about confirming her work schedule. The first part of the journey proceeded normally, with Carlos taking the expected route out of downtown Denver toward Amanda's suburban neighborhood. He made pleasant conversation about his other passengers and his experience driving in the city. But as they reached the outskirts of the city, Carlos began asking increasingly detailed questions about Amanda's personal life, including whether she lived alone, what her typical work schedule was like, and whether she had family in the area. Amanda began to feel uncomfortable with the personal nature of the questions, especially when Carlos started asking about her apartment, complex's security features, and whether she felt safe walking to her car alone after work. Carlos also began driving more slowly and taking longer routes through residential areas, claiming he was being extra careful due to the late hour and potential for drunk drivers. But Amanda noticed he seemed to be studying the neighborhoods they passed through very carefully. When they finally reached Amanda's apartment complex, Carlos didn't pull up to the main entrance as she had requested. Instead, he drove around the perimeter of the complex several times, claiming he was looking for the best place to drop her off safely. During these circuits around her building, Carlos asked detailed questions about which apartment was hers, whether she had roommates, and what her typical schedule looked like on different days of the week. He seemed particularly interested in when she worked night shifts. Amanda realized that Carlos was conducting surveillance on her residence while keeping her captive in his vehicle. She told him firmly to drop her off at the main entrance immediately, but Carlos claimed he was still figuring out the safest location. Carlos continued circling the apartment complex for nearly 15 minutes, taking what appeared to be mental notes about security cameras, lighting, and access points. Amanda realized he was gathering information for potentially criminal purposes. When Amanda threatened to call the police if Carlos didn't let her out immediately, he finally stopped near the main entrance. But as she was gathering her belongings to exit the vehicle, Carlos made comments suggesting he knew which apartment was hers and what her work schedule would be. Amanda quickly exited the vehicle and ran toward her building, but she noticed that Carlos didn't immediately drive away. Instead, he remained parked where he could observe the building entrance and see which direction she went. Amanda contacted building security and asked them to escort her to her apartment. She also reported the incident to the police, providing Carlos's license plate number and driver information from the Uber app. Investigation revealed that Carlos had been using his position as a rideshare driver to stalk female passengers, particularly healthcare workers with predictable schedules. Police found evidence that he had been planning break-ins and assaults based on information gathered during rides. Several other women reported similar experiences with Carlos, where he had asked inappropriate personal questions and conducted surveillance of their homes. Amanda's report helped police build a case that led to his arrest and prosecution. Our ninth story comes from Houston, where 27-year-old oil industry analyst Derek was working late at his downtown office and needed transportation to his apartment in the suburbs. It was nearly midnight when he requested his Uber, and the app showed surge pricing due to high demand. The driver who accepted the request was listed as Miguel, with decent ratings, driving a large pickup truck. Derek was somewhat surprised to see a truck rather than a sedan, but Houston drivers often used various types of vehicles for rideshare services. Miguel arrived on time and seemed professional, helping Derek with his laptop bag and asking about his long workday. As they began driving out of downtown Houston toward Derek's neighborhood, Miguel made normal conversation about traffic and weather conditions. Initially, Derek was pleased with Miguel's friendly demeanor and professionalism. Miguel shared stories about other passengers he had picked up and asked general questions about Derek's work in the oil industry. But as they drove through the sprawling Houston suburbs, Derek noticed that Miguel was taking an extremely indirect route, making numerous turns through residential neighborhoods rather than staying on main highways that would be faster. When Derek questioned the routing, Miguel claimed he was avoiding construction zones and accidents that were blocking the normal routes. He seemed knowledgeable about local traffic conditions, so Derek initially accepted the explanation. However, the journey continued for what seemed like an excessive amount of time, with Miguel making multiple stops at gas stations and convenience stores, claiming he needed to check directions or use facilities. During these stops, Derek noticed that Miguel seemed to be coordinating with other people, making phone calls and having brief conversations with individuals who approached his truck. The interactions had the appearance of conducting some kind of business. Miguel began asking increasingly specific questions about Derek's work schedule, including what time he typically left the office, whether he worked alone, and how much cash he usually carried for business expenses. Derek started to feel uncomfortable with the personal nature of Miguel's questions, especially when combined with the multiple stops and indirect routing. He began to suspect that Miguel was involved in criminal activity and was gathering information for illegal purposes. The truck continued through increasingly isolated areas on the outskirts of Houston, passing through industrial zones and undeveloped areas where there were few lights and no other traffic visible. Miguel's conversation became more threatening as he talked about crime in Houston and how easy it would be for someone to disappear in the vast suburban sprawl surrounding the city. His tone suggested he was making veiled threats rather than casual observations. When Miguel finally stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned gas station in a remote area, Derek realized he was in serious danger. Miguel told him they were meeting someone who would help with directions, but Derek suspected this was a setup for robbery or worse. Derek noticed other vehicles parked around the abandoned station, with their occupants sitting in darkness as if waiting for something to happen. The whole scene had the appearance of a coordinated criminal operation. When Miguel stepped out to talk with the other individuals, Derek managed to escape from the truck and hide behind some storage tanks at the gas station. He used his phone to call 911 while remaining hidden from view. Police arrived quickly and arrested Miguel and several accomplices who were involved in a robbery scheme targeting rideshare passengers, particularly business travelers who might be carrying cash and expensive electronics. Our final and most disturbing story takes us to Orlando, where 30-year-old theme park employee Jessica was finishing a late shift and needed to get home to her apartment near the University of Central Florida. It was past midnight when she requested her ride. Tired after a busy day dealing with crowds of tourists, the app showed a driver named Antonio with good ratings driving a dark sedan. Jessica was relieved to see a well-rated driver, as she had heard concerning stories from co-workers about late-night transportation safety. Antonio arrived promptly and seemed polite, asking Jessica about her work at the theme park and whether she enjoyed dealing with tourists from around the world. As they began driving toward her apartment, Antonio made pleasant conversation about Orlando's tourism industry. The conversation seemed normal initially, with Antonio sharing stories about other passengers he had picked up and asking general questions about Jessica's work schedule and living situation in Orlando. But as they drove through the city, Jessica noticed that Antonio was taking an unusual route through residential neighborhoods, rather than the main highways that would provide the most direct path to her apartment. When Jessica mentioned this, Antonio claimed he was avoiding areas where drunk tourists might be causing problems or accidents. This seemed plausible given Orlando's reputation for nightlife and tourism, so Jessica initially accepted the explanation. However, Antonio began asking increasingly personal and inappropriate questions about Jessica's living situation, including whether she had roommates, what her apartment building's security was like, and what her typical work schedule looked like. Jessica tried to redirect the conversation to more general topics, but Antonio persisted with questions about her personal life. He seemed particularly interested in when she worked late shifts and what time she typically arrived home. The sedan continued through increasingly isolated areas on the outskirts of Orlando, passing through undeveloped regions where new construction was taking place, but few people lived or worked during nighttime hours. Antonio's demeanor began to change as he made disturbing comments about crime in Orlando and how many people went missing in the area without ever being found. His tone suggested these weren't casual observations, but rather veiled threats. When Antonio pulled into what appeared to be a construction site for a new housing development, Jessica realized she was in serious danger. The area was completely isolated, with no lights except for distant street lamps and no other people or vehicles visible. Antonio turned off the engine and told Jessica they were waiting for someone to arrive who would help them get back to the main roads. But Jessica suspected this was a lie designed to keep her calm while accomplices arrived. Jessica noticed that the construction site was surrounded by heavy machinery and building materials that would provide cover for criminal activity. The isolated location would make it nearly impossible for anyone to hear calls for help. When Antonio stepped out of the vehicle to make a phone call, Jessica realized this might be her only opportunity to escape. She managed to get out of the sedan and began running through the construction site toward what she hoped was the main road. Antonio pursued Jessica while calling out threats about what would happen if she didn't return to the vehicle. She could hear him coordinating with others on his phone, apparently summoning accomplices to help search for her. Jessica hid among the construction equipment while using her phone to call 911 and provide her GPS location to emergency services. She remained hidden until police helicopters arrived and located her using thermal imaging equipment. Investigation revealed that Antonio was part of a criminal network that specifically targeted young women working in Orlando's tourism industry, taking advantage of their late-night work schedules and need for transportation. These 10 stories represent just a fraction of the disturbing encounters that occur in rideshare vehicles every day. While millions of trips are completed safely, these cases remind us that we must remain vigilant and trust our instincts when something feels wrong. Remember to always verify A huge thank you to everyone who stayed with me until the very end. Your presence makes this journey into the unknown feel a little less lonely, and I'm really grateful you chose to spend your evening here. I hope these stories gave you exactly what you were looking for. The perfect mix of fear and fascination. There's something special about how we can all come together in the darkness, united by our love for a good scare. I truly hope tonight's tales hit you just as hard as they did me. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel for more creepy content. Your support helps me keep bringing these stories to life, and I'd love for you to be back tomorrow night when I share more mysteries and chills. Until then, sleep tight, dream sweetly, and don't let tonight's stories creep into your dreams. But if they do, just remember, they're only stories. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night.